All right, so have you heard about this? Scientists are talking about fighting climate change with diamonds.
Yeah, it sounds like we're in a sci-fi movie or something.
Right, it's pretty wild.
hmm
But it is a real idea, and that's what we're going to be diving into today.
It's definitely a bold concept, I think. It kind of speaks to how urgent this climate situation is becoming.
Yeah,
Rising temperatures, we're seeing more and more of these extreme weather events. It's hard to ignore.
for sure. So this diamond idea, it's not about, like, digging up more diamonds, is it?
No, no, no. It's not about mining more diamonds. We're
Right.
talking about synthetic diamond dust.
Okay.
Basically, tiny engineered diamonds. The idea is to inject them into the atmosphere, way up high, in a layer called the stratosphere.
Okay, and what would that do? Are we just making the sky sparkle?
Not quite, haha. Though it is a fun image to think about. They
Yeah.
would act like tiny mirrors, reflecting sunlight back into space. And this, in theory, would have a cooling effect on the planet, counteracting some of that warming that we're getting from greenhouse gases.
So it's like we're creating this giant invisible sunshade
Yeah.
made of diamonds. It's pretty crazy.
Pretty wild.
But how much diamond dust are we even talking about here?
Right.
And would it even be enough to make, a real difference?
Well, researchers have actually modeled this, and one study by Zurich suggested that injecting 5 million tons of this diamond dust annually over 45 years could lower global temperatures by, get this, about 1.6 degrees Celsius.
Whoa.
And that's a significant amount when you think about, how much the planet has already warmed.
Yeah, 1.6 degrees is a pretty big dent.
Local.
Okay, but let's talk about the big thing. Cost. Creating and launching that much diamond dust, that can't be cheap.
Oh, you're absolutely right. The estimated cost is astronomical. We're talking around $200 trillion.
Yeah, that's a lot of money.
It's more than the entire global economy.
Okay, so that's a lot. But even if we could somehow afford it, wouldn't, messing with the atmosphere on that scale have some other consequences too?
You're hitting on a really critical point here. Earth's climate system is incredibly complex, and all these things are interconnected, so you know. Changing one thing, even with the intention of cooling the planet, could have a ton of other unpredictable ripple effects. We could be talking changes to weather patterns, rainfall, ocean currents, and even messing with the balance of entire ecosystems.
So we can end up, solving one problem,
Right.
climate change, but then we create a whole bunch of new ones. That's kind of scary. Can you give us some examples of what could actually go wrong?
Okay, imagine, let's say, tropical forests, like the Amazon.
Yeah.
They need a very specific amount of sunlight for all those plants to thrive. If we reduce that sunlight, even with, good intentions, it could throw the entire ecosystem out of whack.
Yeah.
We could see a decline in biodiversity, and it could even affect rainfall patterns.
Yeah, less sunlight means less energy for the plants, which then
That-
that affects the whole food chain.
Exactly.
What about the rain, though? How would diamond dust injection impact rainfall?
That's one of the really big unknowns. We could see some areas getting a lot less rain, leading to droughts, while other areas might actually see an increase in rain, and then you're dealing with floods.
Oh.
It's hard to predict exactly how things will play out because the Earth's systems are so complex and interconnected.
So we could have, some parts of the world are, totally parched,
Right.
and others are underwater.
Yeah.
Okay, what about the oceans? They cover, most of the planet.
Right, yeah. Oceans are very sensitive to changes in temperature, and, cooling the planet with diamond dust could mess with the ocean currents, which are super important for distributing heat and nutrients. And it could also affect marine life, especially phytoplankton, which are like the base of the ocean food web.
Yeah.
They need sunlight, so if we reduce the amount of sunlight reaching them, well, it could have a domino effect on the whole marine ecosystem.
Okay, so even if we could afford it, and even if we got every country to agree to this whole thing, there are still so many unknowns about how it would actually impact the planet. It's kind of like we're playing this giant game of Jenga with the Earth, pulling out one piece and hoping the whole thing doesn't collapse.
It's a good analogy, and it highlights why, even though scientists are exploring this idea, a lot of them are very cautious. The potential for unintended consequences is huge.
So if diamond dust is such a risky idea, why even consider it?
Well, because the threat of climate change is so severe that some scientists believe we need to be looking at every single option, even the ones that seem radical. It's kind of like, if your house is on fire, you're going to try every possible way to put it out, right? Even if it means using some unconventional methods.
Yeah.
But it is essential to understand the risks, and weigh them very carefully against the potential benefit.
Yeah, it's a tough situation. We're trying to find solutions to a problem that's like already happening, and the clock is ticking.
It is.
So while we're thinking about this whole diamond dust thing, maybe we should also look at what happens in places that already get less sunlight naturally. Could that give us some clues?
That's a great point. Let's shift gears a bit and look at some real-world examples of low sunlight areas and see what we can learn.
The most obvious one I can think of is the polar regions.
Right.
They go through some crazy swings in sunlight.
We do.
Months of like constant daylight and then months of darkness. How do the ecosystems there deal with those changes?
Well, the organisms in those regions have evolved
Yeah.
over millions of years to survive under those really harsh conditions.
Yeah.
Plants, for example. They've adapted to grow really quickly during those short summer months when there's tons of sunlight and then go dormant during the long, dark winter. And animals? Well, they've developed strategies like hibernation or migration to handle the lack of sunlight and food during the winter.
So they basically sink their whole lives to the sun.
Exactly. It's a fascinating adaptation.
What about places that aren't as extreme as the polar regions, but still, have pretty low levels of sunlight throughout the year?
Well, cloudy regions are a good example.
Okay.
They tend to receive less overall solar radiation, which can have an effect on plant growth and, agricultural productivity. So crops in those areas don't always have as high of yields compared to places with more sunshine, simply because they're not getting as much energy for photosynthesis. But these ecosystems have adapted over time to function under those conditions.
So all these natural examples, they can give us some insights. It's important to remember that we're talking about creating artificial conditions on a global scale with this diamond dust.
Right, and that's what makes it so complex. Injecting diamond dust into the atmosphere, it's unlike anything we've ever seen before. And the consequences could be a lot more widespread and a lot more unpredictable than what we see in those naturally low sunlight regions.
Yeah, that's a really sobering thought. We're talking about this potential global experiment with no guarantee of success and a very real possibility of creating, even more problems.
Exactly. And that's why this conversation is so important. We need to explore all angles of this idea. We've covered a lot of ground so far in our diamond dust deep dive. We've talked about the science behind it, looked at the potential benefits, the potential risks, and even considered some real-world comparisons. But there's still a lot more to unpack. And in the next part of our discussion, we're going to delve into the potential economic impact, the challenges of actually putting this into practice. And we'll explore some alternative approaches to dealing with climate change.
So welcome back to our deep dive. Last time we were talking about injecting diamond dust into the atmosphere.
Yeah, that's right. A pretty radical idea, to say the least.
Definitely. Out there.
Yeah. And it comes with a big price tag.
Yeah.
Both financially and maybe environmentally, too.
For sure. We talked about the ecological side of things, but what about the economics? That $200 trillion figure
Yeah.
is still stuck in my head.
It's a hard number to even wrap your head around, isn't it? But to make sense of it, I think we need to think about the cost of doing nothing.
Right.
About climate change. Because the economic consequences of just letting things keep warming are projected to be catastrophic, really. We could be looking at trillions of dollars every year, just from the damages caused by extreme weather, rising sea levels, disruptions to agriculture, global trade, the whole 9 yards.
Wow. So is it fair to say then that spending $200 trillion on this diamond dust injection could actually be a way to avoid even bigger economic losses, like in the long run?
Some people who support geoengineering, yeah, that's exactly what they argue. They say that doing nothing is just too expensive. And even a risky solution, something like this diamond dust idea, might be better than just doing nothing. But it's a tough calculation, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of unknowns.
A lot of uncertainty, yeah.
On both sides. So let's break down those uncertainties a bit. You've got the initial cost, obviously, making the diamond dust, launching it up there. But what about, like, the hidden costs? What are we maybe not thinking about?
Yeah, there are almost certainly hidden costs. For example, what about monitoring this diamond dust layer? Once it's up there,
Right.
we need to be constantly checking how effective it is, adjusting our approach, and dealing with any unexpected side effects. That kind of management on a global scale, incredibly complex and incredibly expensive.
For sure. And wouldn't we also need, like, every country to be on board with this? I can't imagine, one country just deciding to, like, dim the sun for everybody else without causing some serious, like, international drama.
You're absolutely right. Global cooperation would be absolutely essential for something like this to even be possible. And that is A huge challenge getting everyone to agree. There would be concerns about unintended consequences, of course, the possibility of this technology being used, for the wrong reasons, and just disagreements about who's in charge, really, who gets to make the decisions. It could very easily lead to conflict and instability.
That's a lot to think about. And
Yeah.
then there's the question of liability.
Hmm.
You know, if something does go wrong, who's responsible for the damages?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, hey, sorry, we accidentally triggered an ice age, but we were just like trying to save the planet.
Yeah, that's right. Who pays for the damage? It's a significant risk, and it raises some very complex questions, legal questions, ethical questions. The potential for unforeseen consequences and potentially catastrophic consequences is huge. So we would need a very clear framework, for addressing that liability before we even think about deploying a technology like this.
Okay, so on the cost side, we've got the upfront expenses, the ongoing costs, the potential for global conflict,
Mm-hmm.
and this whole issue of liability. That's a lot.
Yeah.
What about the benefits, though? Can we even put a dollar amount on those?
It is difficult to quantify, yeah. How much is it worth to prevent the worst case climate scenarios? It's tough to put an exact number on it, but like we said before, estimates suggest that unchecked climate change could cost trillions of dollars per year by the end of the century. And that includes things like damages from extreme weather, rising sea levels, disruptions to agriculture, people being forced to migrate, social unrest, all of that.
Trillions of dollars. Wow, that's just unbelievable. So theoretically, if this diamond dust injection could even, partially prevent those losses, it might actually be a good investment, despite that huge upfront cost.
That's the argument that some proponents are making, yeah. They're saying that the costs of inaction, of doing nothing, are just too high to ignore, and that even a risky solution might be better than doing nothing at all.
It's a big gamble, though, isn't it?
It is.
We're essentially betting the planet
Hmm.
on technology that's still largely untested.
It is a high-stakes gamble, and that's why it's so important to understand all of the risks and all of the benefits, and to really have a conversation as a society about what this means, about the ethics of it all. This isn't a decision that should be made lightly or by a small group of people. It needs input from everyone.
Absolutely.
Hmm?
And while we're having that conversation, we can't forget about the most important solution, which is reducing our emissions
Right.
in the first place.
Absolutely. Geoengineering, even if it works perfectly, can't be a substitute for that, for reducing our emissions. It's a potential temporary measure, something to buy us time while we figure out how to live more sustainably. But the real solutions are about addressing the root cause of climate change, which is our dependence on fossil fuels.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a wound,
Yeah.
but not actually treating the infection.
Yeah. Exactly. You're just covering up the problem.
Mhm.
So investing in renewable energy, improving energy efficiency, figuring out a way to transition to a low-carbon economy, those are the essential steps. Those are the real solutions.
If we have those other solutions, why are we even talking about something as crazy as diamond dust? Is it a sign that we're, running out of time?
I think it reflects how urgent this problem is. We're seeing the effects of climate change now, and they're only going to get worse in the years to come. So scientists are looking at every option, even the radical ones, because they know how serious this is. They're trying to buy us time to implement those more fundamental solutions.
It's like, if your house is on fire, you're looking for any way to put it out. You're going to try everything while you're waiting for the fire truck to show up. But what would those unconventional methods look like when we're talking about climate change? What are the alternatives to something as drastic as diamond dust?
Well, there are a lot of options being explored, and some of them are quite promising.
Yeah.
One is carbon capture and storage. This is a technology that aims to capture carbon dioxide emissions directly from places like power plants, industrial facilities, or even from the atmosphere itself. And then that captured carbon, well, we can store it underground or even use it for other things.
Interesting. What about those natural climate solutions, like planting trees, protecting the forests we already have?
Nature has some of the best solutions to climate change. Trees are amazing. They're like giant carbon sponges. They absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it in their wood, in the soil, protecting existing forests, restoring damaged ecosystems. Those things can make a huge difference in fighting climate change. And they also come with a ton of other benefits, like protecting biodiversity, providing clean water.
So while this diamond dust idea might sound, exciting, a little crazy, it's important to remember that there are other, less risky and potentially more effective ways to deal with climate change, ways that actually work with nature.
Yeah, and these other approaches, focusing on reducing emissions, working with natural systems, these offer a much more sustainable future for everybody. They get to the root of the problem instead of relying on, like, a quick technological fix.
So where do we go from here? We've talked about the good and the bad of diamond dust, the economics, the ethical concerns. What are the next steps if we really want to tackle climate change? Okay, so welcome back to the final part of our deep dive. We've been talking about this idea of injecting diamond dust into the atmosphere, as a way to fight climate change.
Right, a pretty unconventional approach, to say the least.
It is, it's out there. We've looked at the potential upsides, the costs, the huge uncertainties.
Right, a lot to consider.
We've talked about unintended consequences, the politics of it all, the ethics. But let's just say for a minute that we did decide to go ahead with this diamond dust thing. What would it actually take to, like, make it happen on a global scale?
That's the big question, isn't it? The logistics of it all. How do we get from this idea to actually doing it? And it's a massive undertaking, to say the least. I mean, first of all, we would need to make a ton of this synthetic diamond dust.
Yeah.
Millions of tons every year, way more than we currently produce.
Millions of tons. I mean, where would we even get that much diamond dust? Are we talking about, like, emptying out every jewelry store on the planet?
No, I'm afraid those diamonds wouldn't even make a dent in what we'd need.
Okay.
We'd have to ramp up production of synthetic diamonds to a scale we've never even come close to before. We'd need new infrastructure, new technology, a huge investment.
Okay, so we build giant diamond factories.
Hmm.
Then what? How do we get all that dust up into the stratosphere?
Right, another huge challenge. We'd need a fleet of specialized aircraft, planes capable of flying at really high altitudes,
Yeah.
and dispersing the diamond dust evenly across the entire globe. It would be incredibly complex, a logistical operation unlike anything we've ever seen before. We'd need coordination between countries, maybe even entire continents.
And speaking of countries, getting every country to agree to something like this, that's a whole other challenge. I can imagine a lot of countries wouldn't be too thrilled about the idea of another country, basically controlling the global thermostat.
Oh, absolutely. International cooperation would be absolutely essential. And achieving that would be incredible.
What about, like, how long would this diamond dust layer last? Would we need to keep putting more and more up there? And what happens when we decide to stop?
Those are crucial questions, and honestly, we don't have definitive answers yet. It's likely that the diamond dust would eventually settle back down to Earth, which would mean we'd need to keep replenishing it. And if we were to just suddenly stop, well, there's a real risk that the planet could warm up again really quickly, maybe even faster than we're seeing now.
So we could end up in a situation where even if we somehow manage to pull this off,
Yeah.
we're basically committed to it forever,
It's a possibility.
with no easy way to reverse it. If things start going wrong, the whole thing just feels incredibly risky. It's like we're building a house of cards.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's a very precarious situation. And that's why so many scientists are urging caution. We're talking about manipulating a system that we don't fully understand. And the possibility of unforeseen consequences is very real, potentially catastrophic consequences.
It makes you wonder, wouldn't it be smarter to put our efforts, our resources, into fixing the root cause of the problem,
Right.
instead of trying to just cover it up?
I agree. We talked before about reducing emissions, investing in renewable energy. Those are the things we should be focusing on.
Right, exactly. Those are the real solutions.
Absolutely. Those are the long-term solutions. Geoengineering, if it even works, it's a temporary fix at best. It's like, taking painkillers for a broken leg.
Yeah.
It might make you feel better for a little while, but it's not going to actually heal the bone.
So those other solutions, reducing our reliance on fossil fuels, switching to renewable energy, being more efficient with how we use energy, and just living more sustainably in general, those are the things we need to be working on.
Exactly. Those are the changes that will actually make a difference in the long run.
What about those natural solutions we talked about before? Things like protecting forests, restoring damaged ecosystems, that sort of thing.
Nature is an incredibly powerful ally in the fight against climate change. Forests are like giant carbon sinks. They absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it. And healthy ecosystems help regulate the climate. And they protect us from the worst effects of extreme weather. So investing in these natural solutions, it's not only good for the climate, it's also good for biodiversity, for clean water, for clean air. It's good for all of us.
So while this diamond dust idea is interesting,
Yeah.
it's important to remember that there are other, less risky, and probably more effective ways to address climate change. Ways that actually work with nature instead of trying to control it.
I agree. I think focusing on reducing emissions, working with natural systems, those are the paths to a truly sustainable future for everyone.
Well, this has been quite a journey, exploring this diamond dust idea, the good, the bad, the potential, the risks. It's really made me think about climate change in a whole new way.
Me too. It's such a complex issue, but I think it's important to have these conversations, to really explore all the options, even the ones that seem a little out there.
It definitely shows that we're taking climate change seriously and that we're willing to consider, some pretty unconventional ideas to try and solve it. And ultimately, the choices that we make today are going to determine what kind of future we have for ourselves and for future generations.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. I hope it's given you some things to think about.
And remember, the future isn't something that just happens to us. We create it through the choices we make and the actions we take. So until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and let's work together to build a better future.